My lady, before we start the process of hearing the oral submissions from the court participants, may I raise two procedural matters? The first matter relates to the issue of the evening notes prepared by Sir Patrick Vallance. You will recall that during Module 2, during the oral hearing, you ruled on an interim basis that only individual extracts from the transcribed notes be put up on the screen and thereby published. On the 7th of December, you provisionally indicated to the core participants through an email from Laura Taylor that you were minded to adhere to the approach which you had adopted earlier in the hearing, which was that only the excerpts, the individual excerpts which reference had been made, would be published. That email was sent to the core participants, and they were given an opportunity to make submissions in response to your provisional-minded position, but no submissions have been received in response, and therefore may I ask you to make that provisional finding final and to direct that your ruling be published.
I do. Thank you very much.
Secondly, in relation to the documents which are to be published, you of course are aware that some 750 documents have already been published on the inquiry website in relation to Module 2. Of those 750 or so, around 270 were only published in part. Those in part published documents are to be published in full, and therefore they will go onto the website on Monday once time has been allowed for them to be rechecked. In addition, the inquiry legal team has prepared a list of some 430 additional documents which it is proposed should be published. That list, about 700 in all, has been provided to the core participants, and they've had an ability to indicate whether or not there are any additional documents that they would wish you to publish. The position is that has now been reached is this, that when they make their written submissions, they may only refer to documents which have been published. If there are any additional documents which they consider it necessary to reference in their written submissions, then we would ask that they identify them to the inquiry by the 8th of January, and if necessary, any further permission can be sought from you to have any additional documents published. Obviously, only documents which have been published and which have been published with your permission can be referenced in their written submissions. So may I have your permission to publish that list of documents for the purposes of Module 2?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now I'm going to hear from core participants in their closing submissions. Just to repeat something I've said this week already, but that, as I think all the core participants present know, I appreciate the very tight timetable in preparing submissions, and therefore I will also bear in mind the written submissions that core participants make when they've had greater time to reflect on all the evidence that's been gathered and that we've heard. So, Ms Morris, I think you're starting.
Thank you, my lady. My lady, as you know, I make submissions on behalf of the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK. My lady, according to members of his own team, for Boris Johnson's skill set, COVID was the wrong crisis. He was referred to as a trolley by his most senior advisor, oscillating from one position to another, said his head of communications, and as having ostrich syndrome by one of his own ministers. It is striking that these were not the words of a variety of people from within Number 10 and the Cabinet. They're not my words, they're not the family's words, they're not the words of his political adversaries. They are the words from people within Mr Johnson's own team. Regrettably for the bereaved families, and regrettably for the whole country, COVID exposed the weaknesses of Mr Johnson and the fractious nature of his dysfunctional administration. Contrary to some of the ill-informed articles in the tabloids, this inquiry is not examining the rights and wrongs of Brexit. It is not interested in the political colours of those in government at the time. it is certainly not going to be distracted by the soap opera of the language or internecine squabbles in various WhatsApps or other messaging. This is not a court of politics or a moral maze. It is, however, a tribunal of evidence. The real question is whether the Prime Minister and the political leadership were decisive and proactive, or was their response at every turn reactive, too little, too late? Was the machinery of government, both its advisers and its officials, organised in a fit and efficient manner, working in lockstep with each other for the good of the country? For the thousands that we represent, Mr Johnson is the reason that many of them are here. He was the captain of HMS United Kingdom, pretending that the iceberg it was steaming towards was a figment of the imagination. All the while, his lieutenant, Matt Hancock, was conducting the orchestra to play on deck, telling all that everything was fine and plans were in place. Unfortunately, the reality was the opposite. The iceberg was only too real, and it was the plans which were a figment of the imagination. In his evidence, Mr Johnson acknowledged that mistakes had been made, and he said that as the PM at the time, he accepted personal responsibility for them. Anyone watching might have thought this was a laudable approach until Mr Keith asked him the question that all of us who'd actually read Mr Johnson's witness statement were thinking. What mistakes was he actually saying sorry for? It is, of course, a matter for you, but you may think that through his whole evidence, Mr Johnson hardly acknowledged any failures. If that is your view, then his apologies were hollow, and you may think designed to demonstrate a humility, a previously undiagnosed characteristic. Regarding the early stages of the response, there are at least three key features to the Johnson Book of Excuses. First, the UK actually didn't do as badly as some has predicted. Second, if only the UK had been able to recognise the danger of the virus as it came towards us, in particular asymptomatic transmission, then we could have ramped up preparations straight away. And third, that we were taken by surprise at how far along the curve we were in early March. We emphatically reject all three of these propositions. On a separate but important point, whilst accepting that there will be the subject of another module, we also disagree with the narrative that both Mr Johnson and Mr Hancock promoted, that the NHS was not overwhelmed. We say, my lady, that you must look at the overall impact on the whole healthcare system in future modules, including who it could and could not treat, and this proposition must be examined in detail. But returning back to the three propositions, first, the inquiry should be inherently wary of a "we didn't do too badly" narrative, which could only be a basis for complacency going forward. There is no foundation whatsoever for the narrative that, despite the criticisms and predictions, the UK did okay. This bold, sweeping assertion is remarkable for one thing. It has no factual basis. If there was a basis for it, no doubt Mr Johnson and his team of lawyers would have exhibited the evidence. They have not. The inquiry itself has sought the best and most objective international comparison evidence and published it together with a document carefully setting out the basis for the statistics. It shows the UK did very poorly against all but one comparable European country. This was an analysis based on age-standardised excess death mortality rates set against a 5-year average, a carefully thought-through metric. The data came from the ONS, not some think tank, poll or politically charged body or expert. The European data came from Eurostat, widely recognised as reliably standardised and quality assured across the continent. The analysis that the UK was close to the bottom in class does not come from the families, but from the data itself, underlined by the commentary of reputable bodies, including the King's Fund. Whereas the evidence of the global picture is undoubtedly less robust than the European one because of differences in data, again, reputable and properly evidenced studies from the Johns Hopkins Institute of Medicine, amongst others, paint a similar picture of the UK doing very badly indeed against global comparisons. The response of Mr Johnson was that evidence didn't stack up. That is for you to decide, my lady, but we respectfully suggest it will not be an issue which will detain you for too long. Mr Johnson also referred to the fact the UK had its own unique characteristics. That is not in dispute. We have commented on its island's geography, its wealth, its advanced healthcare and public health systems, and one might think these were significant advantages. But, Mr Johnson said, the UK has a higher population density and more older people than many other countries. As a headline, that is so, although it is an English-centric view so far as population density is concerned, as it varies considerably across Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. We do not doubt that population density is a very relevant issue, but it's by no means one which leads to an inevitable higher mortality rate. We've already raised the example of South Korea, a country with a population density almost twice as high and with more older people, but a mortality rate a quarter of the UK. Germany has a similar population density and higher proportion of older people, but a far lower COVID mortality rate. Singapore is a much denser population centre with similar population age profile, but again had a far lower COVID mortality. Mr Johnson continued to deflect away from awkward facts and evidence by hand-wringing about how it had all been different if only we could have seen the problem coming over the horizon, and in particular asymptomatic transmission, and telling us that the real problem was that no one knew where the UK was on the curve until we were into March. Once again, we say that reality, awkward things called facts and evidence, get in the way of his narrative. The reality was that in January and February 2020, he was telling those that would listen that this was a false alarm and that the overreaction would damage the economy. Eminent scientists were under no such delusion. By early January, the UK had designated COVID as a high-consequence infectious disease. Professor Jonathan Van Tam told us that by the 16th of January, and his instinct was telling him that this would turn out to be a dangerous pandemic. Later in January, clear documentary evidence shows us that Professors Farrer, Woolhouse and Ferguson were sounding the alarm, as were Professors Whitty and Vallance, who were of course at the centre of advice to government. There was evidence from China, confirmed by the diplomatic telegram we've seen as early as the 26th of January, that there was confirmed asymptomatic transmission, human to human. Not anecdotal evidence, but confirmed from the Director of the Minister of Health. Further reports from Germany around the same time confirmed that picture, followed only days later by the Diamond Princess mass outbreak in early Feb. Contrary to Mr Johnson's assertion, crucial matters like asymptomatic transmission were identified as early as January. The problem was that the warnings were not heeded. By this time, some things had been done. COBRA had been stood up, as had SAGE. But without leadership, too little followed. And I highlight three central matters: plans, PPE and tests. Once the possibility of a pandemic arose by mid-January at the latest, one might have thought that anyone with an interest in an civil emergency, which would include the Prime Minister, the Health Secretary, the Civil Contingency Secretariat, the CMO, the GCSA, would instinctively reach for the plans, the pandemic playbook. For the avoidance of doubt, my lady, I touched lightly on the fact that the absence of pandemic planning should have been well known to all because of the evidence you've heard in Module 1. But from early January, why was the absence of plans seemingly not a big deal? The only real evidence of this is the contact between Mr Cummings and Mr Hancock, where the Health Secretary assures the PM's most senior advisor that everything's in order and the plans have all been reviewed. Irrespective of whether the view was that the pandemic was on its way, or that it was 50-50, or that it was likely to be a false alarm, it is beyond argument that this was the moment to recognise that there was a major hole in planning that needed to be filled immediately, but precious little followed. Where was the attention to increasing the bed capacity and the availability of healthcare staff, or even to scope what wasn't and was in place in social care? We know from Helen Whately, Minister for Social Care, that only in March did she recognise the lack of infection control plans in care homes. What was done regarding PPE? It is crystal clear that as of January, there were insufficient stockpiles of PPE. No one seems to have known what there was and where. There also seems to have been scant understanding of need, in particular in the care sector, and no real distribution or management plan. By mid-March, PPE requirements for doctors and nurses and cleaners and others working in COVID wards were downgraded. I repeat, downgraded. We say the only reason for this was the lack of proper PPE. Why? Partly because of the failure to stockpile and plan for management during a crisis, and partly because of a failure to surge manufacturing or procurement capacity once the pandemic was on the horizon. We've all seen the headlines in early April 2020, with the BBC, the Daily Telegraph, covering shocking accounts of frontline healthcare workers making their own protective equipment from bin liners. Then there's a story of tests. UK scientists had devised a COVID test admirably early in January. The problem was not the UK did not have a test. It was that our government failed to surge manufacture or procure anywhere near the required capacity until much later in the pandemic. Producing or sourcing tests was no doubt less than straightforward, but it was an entirely predictable problem. Some other countries did so. By mid-March, South Korea had conducted 5 times the number of tests undertaken in the UK. From the beginning of January, the failure to address what Mr Hancock described as a woefully inadequate preparedness and jumpstart a rapid emergency response was primarily a failure of leadership. But by early March, instead of leading the catch-up, Mr Johnson was doing a photo shoot at the Royal Free Hospital, shaking hands with patients with COVID and telling the press he was proud to have done so. By this point, we could all see on the television parts of Italy were being overwhelmed by the virus. 11 municipalities had been quarantined by order of the government on the 23rd of February, yet our government floundered already out-of-date action plans, but little meaningful action. Mr Johnson's point that the UK was taken by surprise by how far along the curve we were by early March has to be seen against that background. Without testing capacity, it was always going to be difficult to understand where things were, but the rapid takeoff of exponential growth was not an unknown, far from it. The PM did not need his advisers to explain exponential growth. He did not need to understand graphs. He just needed to turn the television on. And so we reached the first lockdown, 23rd of March. There seems to be almost unanimity amongst witnesses that the first lockdown could not have been avoided. Equally, it should have been sooner. Mr Hancock says the beginning of March. Patrick Vallance said the lockdown was at least a week too late. So the message we say is clear. It should have been earlier and harder. I say unanimity amongst witnesses because it will not have escaped your attention, my lady, that there have been a number of tabloid articles and questions by some politicians and other commentators as to whether lockdowns were necessary at all. Apparently, they were anathema to some halcyon days of British libertarian values, and the cost was too high. We have no doubt that you'll have no hesitation in following the evidence and tuning out from the background noise outside of these walls. Where evidence has questioned the need for the efficiency of lockdowns, it has been carefully dealt with. You'll recall the dismantling of the Great Barrington Declaration hypothesis by Professor Whitty, the idea that the vulnerable could be shielded whilst the rest of us got on with life as normal. Quite how the vulnerable were to be defined and identified was the first problem, but shielding them whilst the virus circulated amongst the rest of the population would have been impossible. There is nothing anti-libertarian about temporary emergency public health measures to save lives, any more than there is anything authoritarian about the binding legal requirement on the state to do everything reasonably possible to protect life pursuant to Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Sorry to disappoint those who had cast lockdowns as part of a culture war, but the Human Rights Act and English common law are both agreed on this. The point about earlier and harder lockdowns is that they hit the curve at a lower point. It is quicker and easier to flatten the curve before it's out of control. Quicker and easier means less economic damage, less damage to our children, less risk for those escaping domestic violence, less mental health impact, less disproportionate impact on ethnic minority communities, the disabled and the most economically disadvantaged. The fallacy of the lockdown argument is that there is some balance to be struck between public health damage and the economy and other societal damage. Protecting lives protected the economy and minimised other societal damage. Protecting the economy required decisive, swift action, not standing back. Protecting the economy goes hand in hand with a healthy workforce, and that requires first-rate health services with resilience when there's an emergency. I've raised the background noise of ideological commentaries outside the inquiry because it's been upsetting to those I represent and needed to be addressed as such. However, it links to my next point. No one considered lockdown a cure, and any informed person would know that a further wave or waves would follow. What came after any lockdown was therefore crucial. At some point, the curve would be lowered to a point where it was proportionate to ease restrictions. Decisions would be taken to ease back some of the semblance of normality, whilst careful monitoring and ongoing measures would be needed to keep the curve low. Escalation of measures was a probability, if not a certainty. What in fact happened was further delay, disconnected from the science and with the PM and his administration still looking over their shoulders to the ideological doubters. Having suggested that they first followed the science with respect to measures up to and including the first lockdown, Mr Johnson and Mr Sunak then embarked on Eat Out to help out. Having successfully, if belatedly, reduced the infection rate, this policy provided state subsidies for people to gather for long periods in enclosed spaces. Despite the assertion from Mr Johnson that it had been considered and advanced by Professors Whitty and Vallance, that was plainly not the case. Again, there was almost unanimity that Eat Out to help out was a terrible idea, and one which witness after witness would have counselled against if only they'd been asked. Although it's difficult to evidence the effect of Eat Out to help out, Patrick Vallance was able to say that it must have increased infection rates and highly likely to have increased the number of deaths. It is clear from the documents that the government realised just how much worse the figures were getting over the summer. You'll remember that Patrick Vallant's diary entry, where he records Mr Johnson lamenting that things were getting back to the, quote, grim days of March, recognising that things had to be done, recognising and exclaiming in colourful terms that he was going to have to go against a certain section of the media. It might be thought that this was a sort of decisive leadership that had been absent so far. That was the 11th of September. 10 days later, Sage 58 recommended a circuit breaker as part of a connected package of measures to reverse the exponential rise in cases. But the dynamic realisation of the 11th of September had evaporated by then. The science was not followed. Instead, the government embarked upon a series of tiering measures which were doomed to fail and did so. What is most striking about the tier system was the government did not seek advice from Sage or anyone else about it. What this demonstrates, my lady, is that even in the face of a realisation of the dire situation developing over summer 2020, Mr Johnson and his government floundered in the face of ideological opposition and ignored scientific advice. The result was a colossal loss of life in a second wave and a longer and more damaging second lockdown. I want to pick up on three more threads. Following the science, the failure to mitigate foreseeable disproportionate impacts, and governance. There is also a common golden thread, a lack of proper systems in place, crucial for when the next storm gathers. On the evidence, it is clear that an eclectic mix of eminent and concerned scientists were raising the alarm as the pandemic emerged. It is equally clear that many eminent scientists came together as volunteers in the pop-up committee that was Sage and did their level best. This is not an attack on any of the scientists. We are well equipped with eminent experts in all four corners of the United Kingdom. What was missing was their organisation. In Module 1, we've asked you to conclude and recommend that the UK should have a standing scientific committee on pandemics, not an original idea, as the Scottish Government already has one set up. A standing committee would bring together relevant scientific minds in peacetime. It would be able to spot existing major lacunae, such as the fact that there wasn't any pandemic plan, such as a lack of resilience in the health and social care sector, and no excess bed capacity, and hence no ability to meet a public health emergency. A standing committee would be able to gather learning from other parts of the world about their experiences of other diseases. It would be able to advise on what was needed for surge manufacturing, sourcing of tests, lab analysis and PPE. It would be able to gather advanced thinking on MPIs, their efficacy, and how they might work together in different scenarios. Instead, what we had was a pop-up, a standing start, a month into the emergency. How is that the best use of our expertise? Without the joined-up learning that a standing committee would bring, incredible responsibility is placed upon key advisors close to government, and no doubt pressure is placed upon them. Professor Whitty accepts that asymptomatic transmission was known from early on, but there were doubts as to its impact. He thought border controls and screening generally did not work, and stopping mass gatherings would not make much difference. And above all, he advised not to take policy decisions too early in case there was behavioural fatigue. Would a dedicated standing committee have taken such a cautious approach, or would it have taken asymptomatic transmission as a red flag until or unless it was proven less forceful? Would it have counselled hesitation, or would it have urged to go early, go hard on MPIs because it would have had the learning to understand that imperative before the exponential explosion rendered them less effective? Would it have taken a nuanced approach to implementing border measures and restricting mass gatherings, as did other countries who achieved more successful outcomes, rather than serially rejecting them as ineffective? Would a standing committee have pushed hard in peacetime and indeed at the start of the emergency for testing capacity and for a fully functioning TTI scheme? We think so. The lack of testing capacity meant that Professor Whitty and others were flying blind on where we were on the curve. Without resilience and tests, scientists had to go along with discharging thousands of older people from hospitals to the care sector without proper infection control. Without PPE, our brave care workers and key workers, including doctors, nurses and cleaners, were left shamefully unprotected. Did the lack of PPE influence scientists to downgrade COVID in mid-March from an HCID so that doctors and others could be asked to use paper masks on COVID wards rather than respirators? How else can one explain the fact that in the eye of the storm, as the infection rate exploded in mid-March, the fifth worst pandemic in history, ranked by order of numbers of human deaths, was now not considered a high-consequence disease? We are not criticising the scientists here. What was absent was not expertise, but organised standing learning. and evidence contingency measures to respond to various pandemic characteristics. The inquiries heard a great deal of expert evidence regarding disproportionate impact and structural discrimination of various kinds. All diseases affect people with different characteristics differently. It is obvious that this will be the case with a pathogen such as COVID. Some of those differences will not be apparent until the path of the disease is observed. However, many disproportionate impacts are predictable to a significant degree and therefore foreseeable. The devastating and disproportionate effect of COVID on people living with various disabilities, including learning difficulties, autism and Downs, for example, was entirely foreseeable. The disproportionate impact on various black and ethnic minority communities was predictable too, but the evidence shows that little or no thinking was given to these issues until data became available quite late in the pandemic. Why was the ethnicity subgroup of SAGE not formed until late August 2020? Why was no apparent consideration given to the provision of racially, culturally or gender-appropriate PPE? Was it not obvious that structural issues meant that key frontline workforces had disproportionate numbers from particular ethnic groups and that needed to be addressed ahead of time? What was particularly upsetting for our families was evidence from an Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, who seemed to both minimise structural race issues but also suggest that addressing disproportionate impact was unlawful under the legislation. To remind you of just two pieces of her evidence, Ms Badenoch suggested that the evidence has shown that being an ethnic minority was not the cause of being disproportionately impacted. It correlated with what the causes were, the comorbidities. That was absolutely not the evidence. Disproportionate impact was related to structural issues, such as the fact that black and ethnic minority workers make up a huge proportion of the health service and care sectors and transport, and the gig economy, all high risk. Later, Ms Badenoch chose an example of Pakistani taxi drivers and that it would be wrong to provide measures aimed at alleviating their risks because they were also white drivers and targeted measures were unlawful, she said. No one was suggesting that black workers should be favoured over white workers, but measures aimed at addressing disproportionate impact are plainly not favouring persons of one background over another, and equally plainly, they are not unlawful in the way suggested. The failure to address disproportionate impacts was, in our submission, itself an aspect of structural discrimination, and the views of an equality minister appears to triumph ideology over reality and the law. My lady, in terms of governance, the evidence has exposed the shortcomings of the workings of central government. Below the ministerial level, we have seen the interface of the political officials and civil servants. In many, perhaps most administrations, this may work perfectly well, with clear demarcation of roles and due deference between them. However, we have witnessed what happens when that is absent, with an avowed disruptor brought into the centre. He who Mr Johnson could not bring himself to name in evidence was given almost unfettered power and used it, or more accurately, misused it. Undeniably, Dominic Cummings and others around him were allowed to create a toxic atmosphere, white and male, which scared off competent others and created a dysfunctionality we have seen through countless messages stirring up internecine conflict. Add to that a culture of indifference to abiding by their own regulations, and the evidence exposes the Johnson administration to have been rotten to its core. How to put that right is another matter. Professionalising the system of SPADs and political appointees is more difficult, still as it performs part of the democratic remit of governance. But there are potential measures which the inquiry may consider, such as a transparent system of reviewing diversity and culture at the heart of government, which may be appropriate going forward. My lady, you will note that I have made it through this short submission without reference to the detail of the messaging or the language. Ingenious devices have been advanced by many as to why the inquiry should take a circumspect view of WhatsApps and emails and late-night notes. Whilst accepting that they have a different status to formal meeting minutes, we reject all attempts to diminish their importance. This evidence is not ephemeral, as has been suggested. Sounding off, some of them might be. More brutal due to the brevity of WhatsApp character limit, maybe. But these are generally invaluable contemporaneous evidence which every forensic process seeks. My lady, if the failings of Mr Johnson, Mr Sunak, Mr Hancock, Mr Cummings and others are laid bare by their own unguarded comments, they only have themselves to blame. Those are my submissions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Morris. Ms Campbell.
the most important duty of government is to protect human life. So said the former Prime Minister to you in his evidence. At the end of this module, my lady, our clients reasonably challenge the contention that, firstly, this principle remained at the heart of all government decision-making, and secondly, that enough was done. You know that those we represent are concerned that the devolved issues in general and Northern Ireland in particular were a mere afterthought on the part of the UK government. In our oral opening submissions, we said that this was significant, as it meant that Northern Ireland did not have a voice in decisions that were of fundamental importance to us. We noted that this was crucial in assessing the extent to which Northern Ireland was hindered in its ability to reach informed decisions, either despite of or because of the reliance on the UK government response. In this context, it may in fact be the evidence that you haven't heard which speaks the loudest. It is striking that in relation to the big decisions, or when considering essential matters for a response, not only were Northern Ireland decision makers not in the room, but there is no evidence before you of any consideration of the people of Northern Ireland and the context of the north of Ireland in the decisions that were made. By way of example, there was no Northern Ireland representative on SAGE at a crucial early stage of the pandemic. You know that, and you've heard it before. The evidence now tells us that scientists from the devolved administrations were only routinely invited from early March. However, we also know that there's no evidence of any Northern Irish participation on SAGE until the 28th of March, or, according to one witness, until early April. That in itself is a disconnect that requires an explanation, and it may be that you were able to gather further explanation in the course of Module 2C. But one thing does seem clear. There was a remarkable lack of curiosity on SAGE or in the UK government about why no scientists from the north of Ireland had turned up, had taken up the invitation. There's no query about where the North of Ireland representative was, noting the importance of the decisions for the jurisdiction and the need for their input. Nor did anyone in the UK government receiving SAGE minutes query why there was no attendance from a scientist from Northern Ireland. There's no concern expressed that scientists from the devolved administrations may add value by identifying important local distinctions which require consideration. There's just silence on this issue. And of course, this was during the period when there were crucial decisions being considered by SAGE that would at least in part determine the course of the pandemic response. Advice about whether to take measures at borders, advice about mass gatherings, identification of limited capacity for test and trace. We are told by Professor Sir Chris Whitty and others that the lack of a Northern Irish participant was unfortunate because when a representative from the devolved administration did attend, this benefited discussions. But the very lack of consideration of why there was no one in attendance during this critical period is striking. It just doesn't seem to have entered anyone's thinking. And in any event, there's no mention of any consideration before you in this module. That absence was significant. The silence speaks volumes. At this crucial part of the pandemic, SAGE, like the UK government, was taking what appeared to be a particularly Anglo-centric approach. You have heard, for example, about how the warning bells were sounded in the UK government about failures in test and trace. By mid-February, SAGE had identified that capacity for community testing would run out in 2 to 4 weeks. And that is, in fact, what happened. But perhaps more significantly for those that we represent, what you have not seen or heard is anyone identifying that at that time, despite having a significantly lower prevalence of the virus at that stage in the north, Northern Ireland did not even have a full test and trace system in operation. They had a pilot scheme. There's no expression of concern about this or even mention of it in the early SAGE minutes. There's no evidence of any questions being directed to SAGE by UK government politicians, by the territorial offices, by civil servants or political advisors, asking whether the position on testing was the same for all the devolved administrations. You heard no testimony for any witness who said, "This was a matter of concern to me. I raised it at the highest or indeed at any level." Again, it didn't enter consideration. Similarly, with respect to NPIs, modelling informed decisions taken and measures implemented. However, it's not clear that there was any modelling done on behalf of the North of Ireland during the pandemic, certainly not on the evidence that you have heard so far. Professor Medley, the co-chair of SPI-MO, stated to you in evidence, "The nation I didn't really have any involvement with at all is Northern Ireland." I think right at the beginning, or early in the epidemic, it had been suggested that I had a call with the Chief Medical Officer for Northern Ireland. But that, I don't think, ever transpired. So yeah, I'm not very proud of that. It didn't happen. I didn't have sight of what Northern Ireland were doing in terms of modelling. These omissions and this failure to consider devolved issues at all is significant. This inquiry is concerned with the response of the UK government at this stage, and one purpose is to ensure that any mistakes made may be avoided in future. In one sense, it may be that the process, rather than the outcome, is the most significant in order to achieve that goal. It can be accepted, of course, that for an unprecedented and deadly pandemic, even for those acting in good faith and professionally, mistakes can be made. What is more important is that processes are adopted that can minimise the scope for such mistakes. As you know, this is reflected, for example, in the requirements of Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights, protecting the right to life, which, as you well know, imposes an obligation of means, not an obligation of results. What is important is that the mechanisms which protect life are in place. For Northern Ireland, during a pandemic of this nature, we submit that this should have meant that decision-making structures were adopted and adapted to take into account and place value on the views of our local representatives, locally elected leaders, to ensure that their concerns could be factored into UK decision-making, to ensure that they were properly engaged in a process of consultation and not simply dictated to. As with SAGE, concerns about the approach of the UK government arise. You've heard that there was a lack of central government engagement with the devolved administrations, and you know about the move from COBRA to the 815 meetings, the recommendation of the use of the Joint Ministerial Committee, and the fact that no JMCs, in fact, took place within a relevant period. You know about the communications via Mr Gove. Denying that there were failures in communications, Mr Gove termed it a diminution of contact. In one sense, the title matters little. This was an unprecedented pandemic. There was a need for coordination across all administrations and the involvement of DA leaders in decisions with relevance to their electorate. Far from a halt or diminution in contact, there should have been a maintenance or increase in regular and systemic and meaningful contact at the highest levels and the involvement of the DA leaders in decision-making. This approach was particularly concerning as it appears this lack of engagement was not taken for any public health reason or any desire to ensure that the best response was taken to the pandemic for the citizens of the devolved nations. Rather, the motivation appears to have been starkly political, or worse still, personal. This was apparent from the readout of a meeting between the territorial offices and the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster. The Secretary of State Northern Ireland readout of that call identified a number of reasons why the Secretary of State and his equivalent in Wales and Scotland did not think a weekly meeting with the DAs was necessary. The concern is more about political handling than pandemic response. It is in fact striking from that readout that there are no concerns identified about the lack of an NI test and trace system, about the legitimate need to look to the south of Ireland's pandemic response, or indeed about any substantive issue in relation to Northern Ireland's pandemic response. The concerns are purely political. The goal is control. A further justification advanced by the Westminster Government for seeking to limit the involvement of the DAs in decision-making is leaks. It's not in fact clear whether this was the case in practice, but even if there were leaks, the question arises, who do leaks pose a problem for? Is this properly a public health reason to exclude those with local knowledge from the decision-making process in a pandemic? Surely, my lady, not. The exclusion of the DAs from decision-making for fear of apparent leaks amounts to a prioritisation of political optics over public health considerations and the real need to protect the lives of the citizens, in particular of Northern Ireland. You heard about mixed messaging. Lord Lister, a key advisor to the then Prime Minister, was asked by your council what the issue was with Scotland adopting a different approach, as of course they were entitled to do. He identified that one concern was that mixed messages were causing confusion. When pressed, he identified that there was a strong view from, quote, the media side at number 10, that you have to have one simple message that goes to everybody, end quote. We note that this strong view did not emanate from the CSA, the CMO, SAGE, or even SPI-B, rather the media side at number 10. That suggests that this was not a decision based on the welfare of the citizens of devolved regions, it was rather a political issue. That is a problem in itself. However, there's a more fundamental problem with that answer and the reasoning underpinning it for those we represent. This was expressed to you very clearly by Katrina Miles in her evidence to you when she said, there's no denying it, it doesn't matter what political persuasion you are, we share an island with the Republic of Ireland, and rules and legislation set out in Westminster didn't really allow for the fact that we have a land border. That means that in some cases, for example, the Derry and Donegal border, you could have a house on one side of the fence having to abide by one set of rules and legislations, and yet their neighbours on the other side of the fence had a completely different set of rules. And then you had people that were moving through two different regions for work purposes, social purposes, etc. It got so confusing at times for people. It was very hard for normal people to work out if they were abiding by the rules and which rules they were abiding by. My lady, you may reasonably conclude that a one-size-fits-all solution dictated by Westminster to the DAs does not work. In the context of the North of Ireland in particular, this should have been obvious to and factored into Westminster decision-making. In fact, the evidence before you suggests that this basic reality is still today not appreciated by those in power in Westminster. And of course, it's not just ordinary people who were aware of this reality of life in Northern Ireland. This is not just a post hoc concern raised by those we represent. Dr. Michael McBride, the Northern Ireland CMO, messaged Chris Whitty and indeed all of the devolved CMOs on the 10th of March 2020 to emphasise that what was important to him was not only a UK-wide agreement on timing, but also north-south consistency on the island of Ireland. Our concern is that there is no evidence of any significant step taken by those in central government to address this concern. No evidence before you in oral or written testimony. It's not just an afterthought. It doesn't appear to have received significant thought at all. One demonstration of that is that no more than 10 days after that message from Dr. McBride to his fellow CMOs, you have evidence that on the 20th of March 2020, in a phone call between Simon Coveney, the Irish Taoiseach, and the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Coveney suggested holding a British-Irish intergovernmental conference involving all administrations, which would be important to ensure that not only north-south issues were discussed, but also east-west issues, that five-nation, two-island approach that you heard of in Module 1. The Foreign Secretary agreed with Mr. Coveney and suggested that it would be chaired by himself or the CDL and said it was a good idea. Despite this, there was no such conference held that month in March 2020 or the following month or indeed throughout 2020. In fact, there's no evidence of whether this received further consideration at all within Westminster beyond the initial acknowledgement that it was a good idea. Again, the absence of evidence is telling. My lady, you have heard with particular reference to Scotland about concerns in Westminster that the DAs would introduce measures sooner than the UK central government or ease restrictions later than central government, purely, it's suggested, for the sake of being different. When that justification is scrutinised, it's apparent that the objections of Westminster were again political. This is perhaps best exemplified in the witness statement of Boris Johnson. The complaint that he chose to give prominence to in that no doubt carefully crafted statement, which we only received in August 23, was that Scotland announced limitations on mass gatherings before the UK central government introduced their own restrictions. What is striking about this being used as the most prominent complaint about divergence is that everyone now seems to accept that one aspect of the UK response which should have differed is that limitations on mass gatherings should have been introduced earlier. That is now the position of Sir Chris Whitty, Sir Patrick Vallance, and even Boris Johnson, who, when asked by your council whether mass gatherings should have been stopped before the Cheltenham races or the Liverpool Atletico Madrid match, he said, with hindsight, we perhaps should have done that, and I agree with you. So Mr Johnson's criticism of the Scottish administration is that they sought to impose a public health measure earlier than the UK government in circumstances where he now accepts that this step should have been taken earlier, and where expert evidence suggests that earlier action saved lives. Criticism of the Scottish administration's decision is not, therefore, consistent with public health concern for the people of Scotland or any of the devolved nations. And even apart from that example, in the evidence before you, there is no criticism of any divergent step taken by any DA on the basis that it resulted or was likely to result in a worse outcome for their citizens, or that it failed to sufficiently protect lives. Not a single line of a witness statement or sentence of oral testimony identifies that as an issue. Those who identified divergence as a problem were concerned with the concept of divergence itself. The concern was political, not protective. We cite the example of mass gatherings not because it's the most important decision for pandemic response, although it was important and it does have particular consideration for Northern Ireland, to which we will return in our written submissions, but because considering how these decisions were made and why divergence has been so criticised, strongly points away from any recommendation being made by this inquiry that there should have been a single UK approach dictated by central government to the devolved administrations, crafted without the benefit of local expertise, implemented without taking into account local distinctions, or indeed the scientific reality, including that which existed by the physical separation of the island of Ireland. Michael Gove agreed in his oral evidence that there were bound to be differences in the between the DAs and central government in terms of a common approach, and that thoughts to the contrary were unrealistic. We agree, and we suggest that this inquiry should also agree. It is perhaps this reality which has caused such difficulty for those who advocate the single UK approach as they struggle to square what is essentially a political view with the geographic and scientific reality. In what could be considered remarkable, but at the same time unsurprising, this seems to have resulted in Mr Johnson, in his evidence to the inquiry, flip-flopping on what is the best approach to govern relationships between central government and the devolved nations. In his statement, as I say, signed only in August, he decidedly advocates the use of a pan-UK Civil Contingencies Act so as to, quote, bind the UK together. In his oral evidence, he vacillated, offering to Mr Keith, well, I've got an open mind. I see a lot of my colleagues are against the Civil Contingencies Act. I'm happy to defer to them on that point. Under questioning on behalf of those whom we represent, Mr Johnson appeared to accept the force in the view that the pandemic response must allow for regional flexibility and divergence, taking into account that Northern Ireland forms part of a separate epidemiological unit, though adding that, with respect to the DAs, the more unified we can be, the better. It seems that my lady has an example of Mr Johnson flip-flopping in real time, taking one position in his witness statement provided in August, changing his mind under questions from Mr Keith, and finally reaching a position that is not quite clear. We don't identify this to make any ad hominem attack. The significant point is that it again suggests a lack of proper consideration of how the desire for a consistent UK message delivered by central government is compatible with scientific reality and the fact that different approaches may be necessary in different jurisdictions, a reality that Mr Johnson also appeared to accept. That conclusion finds further reinforcement from his explanation of why he opposed regular meetings with the DA ministers. In his witness statement, he asserted decisively that this would be optically wrong. It was a deliberate decision because it would give the impression that the UK were a kind of mini EU of 4 nations, as if we were meeting as a council in a federal structure. It will be apparent to my lady that this view is not based on the needs of citizens responding to an unprecedented pandemic, rather on political optics. We suggest that this focus was and remains misplaced. Mr Johnson continues in his statement, quote, some will say I should have simply made more of an effort using all of my powers of persuasion to get the DAs to stick to the UK line. I disagree, end quote. However, with the characteristic flip-flopping, some call it trolleying, of which you have heard, he volunteered to Mr Keith in evidence. If I had my time again, with hindsight, I think this is an area where I would have tried, even though I was very pushed for time, I would have tried to spend more time with the DAs and tried to bring them with me. It's concerning for those that we represent that not only were decisions made in relation to devolved administrations for the wrong reasons in 2020 and 2021, over 2 years on, Mr Johnson has yet to agree with himself about what the correct approach would have been, or should have been. My lady, briefly dealing with Partygate, the focus on optics also appears to have affected the government's response to the revelations of parties in number 10. You heard the heartfelt testimony from Miss Miles, who described how her funny and articulate father would die alone in December 2020, while in Westminster there were Christmas parties. You know that she and her family are not alone in that pain. My lady, you have heard the inadequacy of Mr Johnson's response to that evidence. It was unconvincingly suggested to you and to the public that he could not have stopped the parties, and that a single text message sent in December 2021 demonstrated that he had cared about breaches of the rules by his own administration. What is striking about that message is, again, the concern is optics. We should have thought about how it would look. There's no concern expressed for the relatives of those who died alone, in many cases confused with enforced separation from their family, denied dignity in death, while those making the rules engaged in bring your own booze parties with suitcases full of purchased alcohol. Nor indeed is there any concern about the devastating impact it would have in public confidence in governance. A word on hindsight before I conclude. There is an important point to be made about the significance of processes and factors that this inquiry is considering. One concern for those that we represent is that for many of the big decisions, the evidence at the time identified that the approach was wrong or ill-considered. But for some reason, this was not properly identified or acted upon. We will return to this in more detail in our written submissions, but there are numerous examples to support that hindsight is no defence. TTI, mass gatherings, asymptomatic transmission, and the appreciation of what was happening in Italy in February and early March 2020. Hindsight, my lady, is no defence for the mistakes that many of the key decisions, mistakes in relation to many of the key decisions in the pandemic. That is particularly, of course, the case for the second lockdown, when the administration seems to have invented time travel, given that they were making the same mistakes all over again. We make these points not to criticise those decision makers who were acting in good faith, but to dispel the notion that these decisions can only be considered flawed in hindsight. That is not supported by the evidence, and we respectfully suggest that this inquiry should make clear in its findings that hindsight is no excuse and that foresight should have been present. I'd like to finish, my lady, with the words of Miss Miles. This inquiry has an unenviable task, and we feel a great responsibility to those we represent, who are, as Miss Miles noted, a group who never thought we would come together. She has made clear her concern, which is a shared concern for those we represent. She says, and I quote, "We have a shared loss, unfortunately a shared trauma. It would be a travesty if what happened to us and our loved ones was allowed to happen again. So really the main thing we want from this inquiry is accountability and reform. We're not saying that everything went wrong, but we just want the truth to be out there, and to know that if and when something like this hits our shores again, that we will be better prepared and that there will be nowhere for those in power to hide." My lady, we ask this inquiry to hold and to heed those words until we have the opportunity to welcome you to Belfast in April next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Campbell. Ms Mitchell, I'm just looking to see whether it's time to take a break, but it's a bit early. Ms Mitchell.
I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish Covid bereaved. In Module 1, we found out that the little pandemic planning that did exist was for the wrong pandemic. In this module, we found out that we had a Prime Minister, the man ultimately responsible for all decision-making, described by those closest to him, saying his was the wrong crisis for Boris Johnson's skill set. It would be difficult to understate the horror, the rage, the pain felt by the Scottish Covid bereaved who had to listen to some evidence in this module. Between January and March 2020, the only advantage the UK had was time. This was squandered by the UK government as we all watched in real time the tsunami of the pandemic sweeping through Italy and the rest of Europe before reaching our shores. In that crucial period, the virus grew at an exponential rate. The UK government failed to check there was any pandemic plan in place, failed to ensure testing capacity was available, failed to identify the likelihood and then the effect of asymptomatic transmission, failed to check whether there was sufficient PPE, failed to impose border restrictions, failed to understand the science they later claimed to be following, failed to lock down in time, failed to consider the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on the vulnerable, the disabled, and on the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, failed to recognise the specific impact on the health and social care sector. Instead, the collective hamartia of this group was their groundless confidence that the UK would be okay, despite every comparative example, particularly in Europe, pointing to the opposite outcome. The hubris of the UK government left us defenceless by March 2020. By Friday the 13th March 2020, the horror that the civil service and politicians began to understand, what the scientists had known for many weeks but were seemingly unable to communicate or have understood, that the pandemic would rapidly overwhelm us and our beleaguered health services. Far from dealing with a Churchillian leader, the politicians and civil servants, themselves involved in infighting in a toxic, misogynistic and macho working environment, found themselves managing a Prime Minister, which meant repeatedly having to explain basic facts about the virus, not pushing things too heavily in case they pushed them the other direction, as we saw the evidence of the handshake. And he careered about so wildly that he was referred to as the trolley, agreeing with the last person who popped in to speak to him when he'd been left unsupervised by his advisors. Post facto suggestions that a Hegelian method of decision-making was employed is laughable in the face of the evidence of the most senior servants in this country. The Cabinet was sidelined, Cobra was a sham, Potemkin meetings where decisions taken earlier were rubber-stamped. The democratically appointed representatives from Scotland were excluded from meetings, blocked from meeting the Prime Minister for optical reasons, but were then accused of playing politics. Scientific advice was dismissed in favour of the breezy optimism of the ill-informed. Our people faced the greatest threat since World War II. Yet at the very time when we were all being urged to come together, the truth of the matter was that the UK government was falling apart. General apologies offered for failure suggest a humility not followed through in evidence by politicians. Many took repeated opportunities to explain what they thought they had done well, rather than actually answer questions. Most of the evidence we have about what actually happened during the time has not come from minutes of meetings or documents created by public bodies. It's come from the WhatsApp messages of those in government and the contemporaneous notes made by, for example, Sir Patrick Vallance and those involved in the decision-making process. Evidence before this inquiry has exposed the chaos, dysfunction, and Boris Johnson's own words, those at the heart of his government, were engaged in a disgusting orgy of narcissism. A government incapable and unable to act when called upon to do its duty to protect its people. From Friday the 13th March, there followed 10 deadly days of delay before the decision to lock down was taken. During that period, the virus was doubling every 3 days, and this inquiry heard the shocking evidence of the then Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who said that locking down 3 weeks earlier would have cut deaths in the first Covid wave by 90%. As the pandemic continued, the toxic environment spread beyond the UK government. The Scottish government was accused of taking decisions for the sake of being different, rather than acknowledging the obvious fact that the Scottish government was responsible for the health of its nation and that of Scotland. Most often cited examples of doing things differently for the sake of it were the cancelling of mass gatherings and the use of face masks in school. It was suggested at the time that the Scots were going soft on mass gatherings and wanting to make totemic decisions to shut them down. Evidence before the inquiry confirms Boris Johnson's stance that he should have cancelled mass gatherings earlier. In relation to the face mask policy, the World Health Organisation advice changed, and in the days after the Scottish Government changed its policy, the UK Government, sometime later, followed suit. Boris Johnson suggested the most crucial tool in the pandemic was communication. Those within the UK Government repeatedly suggested that the First Minister, speaking to the people of Scotland about the health of the nation, was apt to cause confusion. Yet has plainly been shown by expert evidence, at a time when clarity of messaging was so critical a tool, potentially deadly confusion was caused by the UK Government, who repeatedly failed to properly distinguish the pandemic health messages between the 4 countries of the United Kingdom, finding itself in public message unable to distinguish between the UK, England, this country and Britain. None of this is to say that the decisions taken by the Scottish Government were always correct. The Scottish bereaved look forward to the same robust scrutiny that has been applied to the UK Government being applied in Module 2A, which starts in January 2024. According to the National Records of Scotland, as of June 2023, when this inquiry began, there were 17,646 deaths in Scotland where COVID was mentioned on the death certificate. In the last 3 years, over 250,000 people have died from COVID in the UK. Each of those deaths not only represents an individual tragedy, but has affected the friends and family, the loved ones of each of those who died. How does this inquiry make recommendations in all the foregoing circumstances? May we suggest the words of the most senior and respected civil servants in the UK Government be considered? Firstly, Helen McNamara, who served as Deputy Cabinet Secretary in Cabinet Office during the first year of the pandemic. She said in evidence, "I think that the important thing is how do you make sure that when anyone is in those sorts of situations again, there are structures and systems that mitigate against what will happen to human beings in that situation." And secondly, Simon Case, from whom this inquiry has yet to hear, but whose WhatsApp messages disclosed what was said in relation to Mr Johnston. Government isn't actually this hard, but this guy is making it impossible. Accordingly, my lady, the Scottish COVID bereaved suggest and outline at this stage a number of possible recommendations. One, a review of the organisational cultures within Whitehall, to look at the entirety of what happened across Whitehall during that period of time, to try to understand why and then how we can make sure that it doesn't happen again. As Helen McNamara noted, I think those are the civil service questions. Why did this happen? Why did the collective group of people decide to do things that are so clearly in the wrong place? And then how do we make sure it doesn't happen again? Secondly, a review of the organisation of government. An insight in this module, which would be fascinating if it were not equally as horrifying, is that there appeared to be no substructure to the UK government. Those formal structures of government that should have been in place were swept away in the pandemic. Groups which should have formed, such as the Joint Ministerial Committee, were not implemented. Meantime, ad hoc groups with no proper structure, authority, due diligence or recording procedure appeared. Without doubt, the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations require a seat at any table where decisions are being taken which affect the people they represent. And that, I would respectfully submit, is something that should also be considered. 3, a review of the culture of government to address the striking lack of diversity, the misogynistic behaviour which saw women talked over and made to become invisible. 4. The role of special advisers to government to be formalised and made accountable to an independent body so that no unelected individuals can enforce their ideas and plan by sheer force of personality, overriding the democratic process. 5. To consider the formation of 2 bodies, Economic SAGE and, in the event of the next pandemic, a UK Science Advisory Council, much like the Scottish COVID Advisory Council, which was set up. 6. Data sharing. There needs to be a centralised unit to bring in health data, to collate it, to aggregate it, and then to disaggregate it, so that in the next inevitable pandemic, we can use one of our most important resources, knowledge, to greater effect. 7. The establishment of an expert hot tubbing group. Experts from different disciplines to assist both the UK government and the devolved governments to advise on the interaction of those disciplines, rather than the government alone weighing up different concerns. Had such a group been in place, the false dichotomy which we have heard about of economy versus health could have been argued and explored by experts in health, economy, behavioural sciences, etc., rather than leaving it to the government. 8, lastly and unsurprisingly, a legal requirement that all communications relating to the work and decision-making of the UK and devolved governments, including, of course, electronic communications such as WhatsApp, must be saved and recorded in order that there be transparency in the decision-making process within government. My lady, these are only some of the outline recommendations from the Scottish from the Scottish COVID bereaved. However, before concluding, at the start of this inquiry, Amar Anwar, on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved, presciently stated, "It is for this inquiry to illuminate the truth. Over the coming months and years, there may be times this inquiry may falter, but it cannot afford to fail, and will undoubtedly come under sustained and repeated attacks. It must, however, never be afraid to raise its voice for the truth. That is the very least we owe to those who lost their lives." There has indeed been sustained and orchestrated attacks, and at times personal, on this inquiry, its chair and its legal team. Those we represent in the Scottish COVID bereaved wish to make it clear that any such attacks on the work of the UK COVID inquiry are an attack on the bereaved who want the work of this inquiry to continue without fear or favour. Before we finalise our submissions, we wish to conclude to peruse some of the disclosure that we still haven't finalised, and also listen carefully today and tomorrow to the views expressed by the other core participants, and we will provide detailed written submissions in January. These are the oral submissions on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Mitchell. Right, I think take a break now. I shall return at 25 past. Ms Harris, just as I was coming in, I don't know if the news had reached you that the news has come through that Mark Drayford has resigned.
Yes, thank you, my lady. We did hear that news. Thank you.
Ms Harris.
Thank you. Good morning, Bore da. I represent Covid-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru, CBFJ Cymru. CBFJ Cymru is dedicated to campaigning for truth, justice and accountability for the bereaved in Wales. Its members have experienced first-hand failures to respond adequately to the pandemic in Wales and the UK as a whole, and the catastrophic effects of those failures. The group seeks answers about what happened in Wales and why decisions which impacted on Wales were made in the way that they were, so that there can be true accountability and lessons learned. The pandemic response in Wales was primarily the responsibility of the Welsh Government acting under its devolved responsibilities, and it primarily must be accountable for that response. However, the UK Government's decisions and UK-level structures also played a part in shaping the response in Wales. In the period leading to the first national lockdown, Welsh Government decisions were aligned with UK Government decisions. All 4 nations sat on COBRA and agreed the Coronavirus Action Plan of the 3rd of March 2020 and full national lockdown on the 23rd of March. How decisions relating to Wales were made will be examined further in Module 2B of this inquiry. But we know that after the 23rd of March 2020, at times, Wales adopted the same policy as the UK Government's policy applicable in England, although at times with later implementation in Wales, for example, the hospital discharge policy and whole care home testing, and at other times, policies were different. For example, the switch to stay-at-home from stay-at-home to stay-alert in May 2020 was not adopted in Wales, and in Wales there was an autumn fire break. The main financial levers were at the UK government level. SAGE was the main source for scientific advice, UK-wide, including for Wales. Against this background, a central concern for the Welsh bereaved families in this module, which will be addressed in this statement, is whether the UK government and the devolved Welsh government collaborated effectively. This statement will also consider some of the key areas of UK government decision-making and UK structures where these have shaped and are relevant to understanding the response across the UK, including Wales. 2 brief initial points. On preparedness, the lack of preparedness for a pandemic is a key matter of context for the subject matter of this module. 2 significant aspects relevant across the UK were the lack of an overarching plan for a pandemic response such as this, and the lack of a scalable infrastructure for testing and for test and trace. As was pointed out in the evidence to the inquiry, had the public health infrastructure in the UK been as developed as in some other countries, other paths and outcomes may have been open to the UK. Professor Hale's evidence to the inquiry was that the most effective governments were able to minimise the use of stringent measures by relying on effective test and trace and isolate systems, and that such strategies are particularly effective when combined with fast, stringent, but limited non-pharmaceutical interventions, MPIs. The UK did not have that infrastructure, which could have given it a better chance of a response that would cause less harm. So this must be one of the key lessons for the future. The second opening point is that in this group's opening statement to this module, we asked if the older population were a cohort who were overlooked by the UK government, whether they were seen as lesser or dispensable. The evidence to the module has shown that this cohort were sometimes spoken about by the then Prime Minister in a way that suggested that they were dispensable. There will be more casualties, but so be it. They have had a good innings, is one example of that type of comment. Turning to the initial response to the spread of COVID-19. At the early period of the response to the pandemic, the evidence has shown fundamental problems in the decisions, actions, and inactions of the UK government. The Welsh government was closely tied into the response at the UK government level in this period, so the evidence provides insight into the response in Wales too. The UK government response was shown on the evidence to lack a sense of urgency, to lack a plan and a strategy. And the lack of a strategy impacted on how science advice could be provided to it. Evidence was given to the inquiry that throughout 2020, SAGE suffered from having little sense of what the high-level strategic objectives of the government were in managing the crisis, and that had it known, it may have reached conclusions about the need to adopt the policies that it ultimately advised faster. The only overarching plan for a pandemic response prior to the 3rd of March 2020, the 2011 Pandemic Flu Plan, which applied to Wales also, was aimed at managing the consequences of a flu pandemic, not stopping a virus from spreading. It was based on the wrong doctrine. Evidence has been heard about exercise Nimbus in February 2020, that it was directed not at what could be done to counter the spread of the virus, but how to prioritise patients in the event of the NHS becoming overwhelmed. As was stated in the evidence, what should have been addressed was at what point to lock down, how much data was needed before making a decision, what NPIs were going to be put in place and in what order, how do you save lives in the least damaging way, and not, are we going to find enough mortuary space, and who should decide on prioritisation for NHS treatment. The Coronavirus Action Plan, a 4 nations document, set out an approach, but was less than a plan for action. References to action points to counter the threat of wide-scale spread of the virus were oblique, and it overstated the extent of any other existing plans in place. The decision made by the UK government on mass gatherings was not to ban mass gatherings and not to advise against them until the 16th of March 2020. The same approach being adopted by the Welsh Government. The inquiry should find, as has been accepted in the evidence of witnesses, that mass gatherings should have been banned earlier. Other countries could be seen to be banning mass gatherings. And on the 12th of March 2020, the number of cases was in the thousands and growing. The people in Wales knew, as evidenced by the fact that you could not buy hand gel anywhere in Wales at that time. Politicians should have thought more widely than just the scientific advice and taken account of the wider context at that time. The evidence to the inquiry has shown that throughout February and into early March, that evidence was emerging about the growing threat of the virus, and this was not being responded to with proportionate speed and focus. And it followed, inevitably, and as the evidence has shown, that the interventions that were necessary were not timely. This includes the 23rd of March national lockdown agreed by all 4 nations. I now refer to asymptomatic transmission. CBFJ Cymru are deeply concerned about the evidence showing that the risk of asymptomatic transmission was not factored into decision-making at the early stage. It is clear that although uncertain, the risk of asymptomatic transmission was known very early on. The way this factor did not inform decision-making, even when there was very high vulnerability to the disease, is impossible to comprehend. The then UK Government Secretary of State and Social Care, when giving his evidence, appears not to have understood or to be ignoring the full findings in the legal case that was brought by Dr. Gardner and Ms. Harris, which challenged the March 2020 hospital discharge policy and other surrounding policies. The court found that those drafting the March discharge policy and the April admissions guidance simply failed to take into account the highly relevant consideration of the risk to elderly and vulnerable residents from asymptomatic transmission. Paragraph 289 of the judgment. We've also heard evidence about the fact that a policy relating to reducing the movements of care home staff between different care homes was not implemented until the 15th of May. Had it been brought in sooner, then it would have prevented some of the spread of infection into care homes, and that the risk of asymptomatic infection had not been properly taken into account in deciding whether such a policy was needed at an earlier stage. Lessons must be learned from the way the system for health and social care failed to do what it was supposed to do to protect vulnerable people in the most fundamental way, and about how a risk that was uncertain, but one that had the potential for devastating consequences, was taken into account in decisions that concerned very vulnerable people. The issues will be returned to in the context of Wales in Module 2B, because Wales adopted a similar hospital discharge policy to the one considered in this module, and will have also needed to consider asymptomatic transmission and very vulnerable populations. I deal very briefly with airborne transmission. In the group's opening statement, we invited the inquiry to consider whether enough was done to consider this factor, the airborne nature of the virus. And in the course of Module 2, the inquiry has heard evidence from Professor Catherine Noakes, who was convener and chair of the environmental modelling group of which was a subcommittee of SAGE. She spoke of this aspect of the virus being overlooked and the need for mitigations which focused on ventilation, the need for care in relation to appropriate face masks that could guard against the aerosol aspect of the transmission. She also referred to the fact that information on the websites of Public Health England and the NHS had not provided up-to-date information and had not referred to the airborne nature of transmission, and that she had needed to contact Professors Vallance and Whitty about this. And indeed, the information on the NHS website was not changed until June 2021. The inquiry has also heard evidence from Dr. Banfield from the BMA about the importance of ventilation, about the importance of FFP2 and FFP3 respirators being available for vulnerable people as offering better protection from infection than ordinary masks, and the need for clearer public health messaging in this area. CBFJ Cymru believe that the seriousness of airborne infection is still not appreciated and acted on in Wales. This is relevant in many settings, including hospitals, and hospital-acquired infection remains a significant concern in Wales. They wish the inquiry to make recommendations at speed about responding to the airborne nature of the virus. I turn now to the subject of intergovernmental relations. The Welsh bereaved families believe that all UK and devolved governments should have worked more closely together with a single aim of providing the most effective response that they could to the pandemic. This was in order to have the best chance of reaching agreement on policies across 4 nations, and where policies were different, so that they could consider the implications for each other of their different policies and coordinate implementation and public announcements. In sum, coordination between nations would lead to a more effective response and better chance of saving lives. In the evidence before the inquiry, there's been frequent reference to a 4 nations approach, used to signify not just the 4 nations acting uniformly, but also flexibility for nations to adopt different approaches whilst coordinating with each other. There are plenty of examples of ministers inviting and endorsing a 4 nations approach, but to what extent did the UK government and the Welsh government do all they reasonably could to promote a 4 nations approach? The inquiry has heard that at the level of health ministers, that there were meetings of the 4 health ministers by regular calls, and that there was also a shared WhatsApp group. Mr. Hancock said that this filled the gap where there had been a missing piece of institutional architecture, and it worked well. He commended the other health secretaries for their approach, saying they left politics at the door, and he referred to the warmth of their relationship. There will be further evidence on the subject in Module 2 and of the Welsh perspective on those meetings. There was also evidence of regular close engagement through the pandemic between the 4 chief medical officers of the 4 nations. There was much evidence about how positive these engagements were. The question must be asked, however, how, when the core science was the same, how were there so many differences between policies in England and Wales that were not avoided, whether in relation to mask wearing or testing or other differences in the plethora of rules after coming out of the first lockdown. These issues will be looked at further in Module 2B, as to whether the differences were because of lack of communication or delay in implementation, or whether there were other reasons. The position as between the Prime Minister and the First Ministers of the devolved administrations must be considered. Mr. Boris Johnson, in his evidence, made several statements to the effect that the relationship was good between the UK government and the devolved administrations. But Mr. Drakeford pointed out that there were significant problems in the structure of the relationship at the Prime Minister and First Minister level during the pandemic. He wrote to the Prime Minister requesting greater collaboration. The inquiry has heard that after the 10th of May 2020, the UK government decided that COBRA would cease to meet regularly, and it did not meet at all between the 10th of May and the 22nd of September 2020. This meant that the four nations, having gone into lockdown together, when they were taking the careful steps of coming out of lockdown, the Prime Minister and the First Ministers of the devolved administrations ceased to meet on COBRA as they had done previously. At that stage, and from then onwards, there were more differences in policies between the UK government and the Welsh government. The inquiry has heard that at that time it was suggested to the then Prime Minister, Mr Johnson, that he convene the Joint Ministerial Committee as a means of engagement with the First Ministers of the devolved administrations. But Mr Johnson decided not to do so. Instead, he decided, with the support of Mr Cummings, that the First Ministers were to have regular calls with Mr Gove. The inquiry has heard that it was considered that Mr Gove did a skillful job, but this arrangement meant that the devolved administration's First Ministers did not have direct contact with the Prime Minister on a regular or predictable basis. There was, as was put by Mr Mark Drakeford in his witness statements, a lack of a regular rhythm of engagement, a lack of regular checkpoints that only the Prime Minister could provide, a vacuum at the final pan-government level. Mr Johnson gave his reasons for making these arrangements in the way he did. In his view, it was optically wrong for the Prime Minister to meet with the devolved administration First Ministers, as though the UK were a kind of mini-EU of four nations. He referred to wanting to avoid the risk of pointless political friction and grandstanding because of the well-known opposition of some of the devolved administrations to the government, and also to avoid leaks. These were not good reasons. Mr Gove's evidence on leaks should be noted. He said, "It is most important to have the right people in the room, and that overall, in the greater scheme of things, that leaks were not a particularly significant concern." The Prime Minister's reasons for not engaging more directly with the First Ministers betray a lack of commitment to serious and grown-up attempts to work with the DAs. That was a wrong mindset, and that mindset was also evident from the comments of Mr Dominic Cummings, when he said that it was thought that Mr Gove would handle the process of dealing with the DAs better, and that generally speaking, the Prime Minister talking to the devolved administrations did not advance any cause. Dominic Raab, in his witness statement, said he found it became irritating as the pandemic went on that Scotland and Wales wanted to do things slightly differently or with different timings for what appeared to be political reasons. It is to be observed there is a clear inconsistency in, on the one hand, criticising the devolved administrations for not aligning with the UK, while at the same time denying them access to the decision-making process. Mr Gove, in his evidence, suggested that there was a case for overriding devolution when it came to the pandemic, which affected Great Britain. And whilst issues such as how much fruit to eat and so on were quite properly a matter for devolved administrations, that such a pandemic might not be. That, of course, it is to be observed, would be contrary to the footing upon which the four nations agreed their response to the pandemic from the start, which was on the basis of settled devolved responsibilities. Public messaging was, of course, very important, and where the four nations did not have the same policy, there obviously needed to be as much clarity as possible about what applied where. The evidence has shown that the UK government did not apply commitment to that goal. And the inquiry has been referred to the report of Professor Henderson, where she analysed speeches throughout 2020, which showed that the UK government did not outline the territorial scope of its information and guidance on many occasions, and also that press briefings were unclear as to when new rules applied to the whole of the UK or were England specific. These are things that could easily have been avoided. Evidence has also been heard about the way in which the change from the message stay at home to stay alert was handled without, again, a clear plan to be clear that the devolved administrations did not change their message to stay alert. The UK media also contributed to the confusion by failing to state when public health messages did not apply in the devolved administrations. Professor Henderson has commented on this. These errors were avoidable. In our written statement, we will make observations about SAGE and about the improvements that there were in coordinating and providing access to the devolved administrations to the Welsh Government, and how we would hope that this will be able to be further developed. To turn to the conclusions that I wish to make on behalf of CBFJ Cymru. There will be many suggested lessons for the future, and CBFJ Cymru contributes the following few points. First, the recently reformed system for intergovernmental relations between the UK government and the devolved administrations should include structures suitable for a prolonged period of crisis, such as a pandemic. In the pandemic, a formal structure for regular meetings at the Prime Minister level, plus the calls with Mr Gove, would have been a better arrangement. 2. Four Nations public communications and announcements need to be conducted in a rational way, being clear as to what applies where. 3. UK-wide science advice structures should be accessible to the devolved administrations, including attending the committees where appropriate and collaboration with the devolved science bodies. 4. Public health information and messaging should be systematically informed by the up-to-date science on infection control measures, which is linked to 5, that there should be greater focus on identifying the whole range of relevant ways of reducing the risk of spread of infection in the community and outside the community and in hospitals, care homes, etc. 6. As to the significant issues that this module raises as to how the centre of government operated in a crisis, this is not dealt with in detail here, other than to say it is clear that there needs to be consideration of structures that will produce better decision-making, of the need to draw on a wider range of life experiences when making decisions affecting huge numbers of people's lives in major ways, and as to how politicians interact with the scientists from whom they seek advice. 7, there will be many lessons in the area of social care from this module and the later modules, and that is a subject too large to attempt here. 2 final points. From the perspective of Wales, as well as the above, what also emerges is that at some levels of the UK government, there was a failure to embrace the task of working with the devolved administrations. There should have been close and grown-up collaboration, which people across the UK were entitled to expect. Whether the Welsh Government did all it should have done to collaborate must be considered in Module 2B of the inquiry, which is yet to come. And finally, the lesson has been learned, of course, that the institutions of the UK government were very far from equal to the task of responding to the pandemic, and that this brought devastating consequences, and we will refer in more detail to that aspect in our written submissions. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Very grateful. Mr Metzer.
My lady, I appear with Sangeeta Iyengar and Shanti Sivakumaran on behalf of the long COVID groups instructed by Jane Ryan of Bat Murphy. Long COVID voices. Our clients are angry. They have been disbelieved, dismissed and ignored, and suffered the ignominy of hearing Mr Johnson's testimony last week. My lady began this module by hearing from those impacted by Covid-19, and it is apt to return now to the voices of our clients. Orly Summers, a COVID frontline nurse who contracted COVID in the first wave, said, "Long COVID had not been mooted as a thing. As a result, my ongoing symptoms were often met with scepticism and a degree of gaslighting." She was sadly not an anomaly. Kim Horsmanshoff said, "I thought it was going to be a cold because I am 37, went to the gym several times a week, and all the messaging was that COVID was nothing to worry about if you were young. My family find it hard to accept that I'm disabled. It's hugely isolating." Many lost their livelihoods. Una Cousins was a professional athlete who was pre-selected for the Olympics as part of the British rowing team. After developing long COVID, she was struggling with cooking, showering, and getting out of bed, all the basic daily tasks. Long COVID has forced Una to retire completely from her rowing career. Parents were not warned that long COVID could debilitate and disable their children. Jessica, a 10-year-old who has lived with long COVID since November 2021, describes how no one at school or in health believed me until I ended up in crisis in hospital with a feeding table. Jessica was very active and loved to roller skate with her family. Now she needs a wheelchair, can't walk or attend school. You heard from our client, Sammy McFarland, during the Impact films. In her statement, she said, "It has been extremely distressing to watch my child, who had been previously completely healthy, happy and dancing around, being unable to move and full of self-doubt. It was like watching my child fade away. She is no longer the child she was." New voices continue to be added to the collective long COVID experience. Today, people will develop long COVID from new COVID-19 infections. They will lose their physical health, their ability to work, to go to school. They will lose their lives as they know them. The lessons to be learned from government decision-making matter now as much as they do for the future. The voices of people with long COVID have been represented by the long COVID groups, long COVID kids, long COVID SOS, and long COVID support, who have followed the hearings closely. They have sought answers to questions they have carried with them since they began suffering from the long-term effects of COVID-19. Their suspicions have been confirmed. First, the long COVID groups have heard evidence of the unfounded dismissal of their illness, exemplified by the attitude of the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Second, the evidence is that long COVID was, at best, an accepted trade-off when decisions were made about easing restrictions, and at worst, entirely ignored as an inconvenient truth. Third, the evidence demonstrates that there was a wholesale failure to use what Mr. Johnson calls the most important tool of public messaging, to communicate the indiscriminate risk of long-term harm to the public, which covers the risk to children and adults of all ages. These cumulative errors have caused avoidable injury and enduring suffering to the long COVID groups. Disbelief in long COVID. The long COVID groups have sought to understand how and why there was an inexplicable delay in the government's recognition of long COVID when longer-term sequelae were foreseeable and well established from other recent coronaviruses such as SARS and MERS. We now know from the evidence that the risk of long-term sequelae was in fact foreseen. The Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Matt Hancock, and the Prime Minister's most senior advisor, Dominic Cummings, both recalled being advised by Professor Sir Chris Whitty, the CMO, and Sir Patrick Vallance, the GCSA, that COVID-19 was likely to have long-term effects on a significant number of people. Yet it took patient advocates already suffering from long COVID to advocate for action. Long COVID is a patient-made term. It did not need to be. Mr. Johnson's attitude to long COVID exemplifies the biases that the long COVID groups were formed to counter. He doubted that people with long COVID had a real condition. This is not true. The scientific evidence and lived experience of people suffering from debilitating long-term symptoms caused by COVID-19 is very clear. Mr. Johnson now claims that his scrawl of bollocks on a box grid in October 2020, this one obscene word, was his attempt to request advice on long COVID. My lady, there are glaring holes in his belated claims that he was seeking advice on long COVID. First, and significantly, Mr. Johnson only came up with the suggestion that he was asking for advice in oral evidence. His witness statement tells an entirely different story of a man who dismissed the suffering of millions, despite the wide range of people who were trying to open his mind to the worrying reality. He waited until late May 2021 to ask his CMO for further information on long COVID. Second, the box grid he was presented with outlined the NIHR report on long COVID, commissioned by Professor Sir Chris Whitty, which reviewed scientific and clinical data on long-term sequelae. He did not ask to see the full report, which he knew was available. Finally, Sir Patrick Vallance said he made the Prime Minister aware of long COVID. This is supported by his diaries, which record Mr. Johnson repeatedly referring to Gulf War syndrome when long COVID was raised. The evidence overall, including that from Mr. Johnson's own witness statement, makes plain that long COVID was an inconvenient truth that Mr. Johnson chose to ignore. This choice caused great harm and immeasurable suffering. Avoidable harm. My lady, a crucial question is whether nearly 2 million adults and children with long COVID was avoidable. Decisions around the introduction of and release of NPIs were matters of life and death, of health and sickness. The long-term harm caused by COVID-19 was a relevant outcome from those decisions. Put plainly, long COVID was not considered in the decisions taken in response to the pandemic. Sir Christopher Warmold confirmed as much, saying that the sole factors under consideration were hospitalisation rates, the spread of disease and the death rate. Is it not simple common sense that long-term harm from a virus is relevant to how a pandemic is managed? Sir Patrick Vallance explained the lack of consideration of long COVID by saying that the COVID pandemic was running at high levels all the way from August through to the end of that year, and so the recommendation was keep the prevalence low. That was not happening, and the consequence of that is more people with long COVID, and I don't think that was something that policymakers were keen to factor in. Professor Sir Chris Whitty, in his witness statement, observed that recognising long COVID could occur at any age had important practical implications, as it made him more cautious to the effects of COVID-19 in the young and in otherwise healthy adults. It is extraordinary that he thought that long-term harm was not something the Prime Minister needed to know in 2020, when Sir Patrick Vallance was warning the Prime Minister and the Cabinet that this was a material consideration. Sir Patrick advised that strategies like segmentation or the Great Barrington Declaration proposal, which allowed high rates of transmission amongst the young, would result in large numbers of people contracting long COVID. The failure to consider long COVID when making decisions on NPIs had three stark consequences. First, before the second wave, the Prime Minister wanted to be the Mayor of Jaws and was actively trying to keep the beaches open while delaying the decision to take a second lockdown. He entertained strategies where he thought by keeping the known vulnerable off the beaches, the rest of the population could go out to sea. As Dame Angela McLean said, there were unknown vulnerable who could develop long COVID. The Prime Minister ignored the fact that the shark in the water could maim anyone. Second, as restrictions were eased, there was little, if any, focus on the need to prevent long COVID. This meant that strategies which allowed high prevalence of long COVID-19 in 2021 did not include mitigation measures to encourage preventative behaviours so people could avoid the risk of COVID-19 and its concomitant risk of long COVID. To the extent that long COVID was considered, Mr. Javid told us that it was at best an accepted trade-off for the release of restrictions. If the risk of long COVID was factored in at all, our clients are entitled to question why simple, uncostly mitigation measures were not kept in place to lower that risk. Third, regarding the financial burden of the disease, the socio-economic costs of a virus cannot be fully quantified and planned for if the long-term impact of the virus is not measured and factored into decision-making. The OBR recognised there will be an economic cost associated with increased cases of long COVID in 2020, but this cost was not factored into government advice until the COVID Task Force paper in April 2021. Even then, the economic cost of long COVID was still not a feature of Treasury advice on NPIs. Mr. Sunak admitted that the impact of COVID on the labour market was misestimated. The Treasury was disproportionately focused on the costs of measures in response to COVID-19 rather than the cost of the virus itself. Decision-making that had factored in long COVID when unlocking NPIs would have prioritised public messaging warning people of all ages of the indiscriminate risk of long COVID and maintained mitigation measures to prevent transmission of COVID-19, such as guidance on mask wearing, improving air filtration and ventilation in public buildings, supporting policy recommendations on clean air, supporting employers with health and safety risk assessments, and ensuring free lateral tests remained available. One of the very many clear examples of the failure to incorporate long COVID into decision-making is in relation to children. As at March 2023, there are at least 62,000 children with long COVID. Mr. Johnson called schools reservoirs of risk. In May 2021, there was agreement between the DHSC, the PHE, NHS and the DFE that messaging in schools should signpost for any child experiencing long-term symptoms following a COVID-19 infection. Yet, messaging and other adequate COVID-19 safety measures weren't put in place in schools, public buildings and hospitals and still don't have adequate measures. Long COVID could and should have been considered in decision-making around NPIs. Public communications of the risk of long COVID. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Hancock and Sir Christopher Warmold have all emphasised that public communications are an important NPI in the toolkit of responses to a pandemic. Yet, there was an unacceptable absence in communications on long COVID. During the pandemic, we watched daily press conferences and looked to our Prime Minister and his closest advisers to provide us with accurate, timely and reliable information on how to protect ourselves, our families and our communities. The Prime Minister did not mention long COVID once. Indeed, we now understand that there was no government communication strategy for long COVID. This left people believing that if they were otherwise healthy, they would recover quickly when they fell sick, as they had been reassured would be the case for the majority of people. Mr. Hancock acknowledged the role that the long COVID groups played in drawing his attention to the impact of long COVID and the need for better communication. Yet, the one video with its single accompanying press statement issued by the DHSC on long COVID in October 2020 was simply not enough. It came months after public recognition of long COVID in the US by Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus from the WHO. After October 2020, there were no slogans, no public health messages, and no campaigns on long COVID by DHSC or across government. On being pressed by Ms. Cecil, Mr. Javid admitted that there was no communications campaign on the risk of long COVID to the public under his watch. In the absence of public messaging, people felt frustrated and abandoned. Professor Sir Chris Whitty has admitted that it would have been helpful to acknowledge long COVID at an earlier stage. The overwhelming picture is that people were not warned that they were all, including previously fit, healthy, active people, indiscriminately at risk of suffering from long-term ill health from COVID-19. The public deserved to know the risk that long COVID posed to them so that they could take steps to protect themselves from it. Decision makers could and should have used the preventative tool of public messaging to communicate the risks of long COVID. Recommendations. My lady, the long-term impacts of COVID-19 are but one aspect you will need to consider in relation to the response to the pandemic. We have heard evidence which sheds light on the inner workings of government at the height of the crisis. You may conclude that the decision makers at the heart of government could not be trusted to make rational, consistent, strategic decisions to guide the country through this crisis. Looking forward, we hope that this inquiry will make findings and recommendations that will ensure that we are better prepared to respond to pandemics. It is simple common sense that long-term harm from a virus must be a relevant consideration for government to protect the public. The unjustifiable delay in imposing NPIs, including the first and second lockdowns, meant that people needlessly contracted COVID-19 and developed long COVID. Suffering has been the avoidable cost of delay and indecision. The evidence you have heard suggests that maintaining low levels of transmission of a novel virus is better for economic, health and social outcomes, and it means that lockdowns can be introduced with more notice and shorter duration, reducing the economic impact of those measures. However, the experiences of those with long COVID have illustrated that it is not enough to focus exclusively on the short-term impacts of a virus. When challenged about the lack of consideration of long COVID, decision makers fall back on the defence that preventing COVID-19 meant preventing long COVID. Aside from the obvious point that decision makers failed to prevent high transmission of COVID-19 and indeed came to accept it as part of their policies in summer 2021, this approach fails to grasp that there are additional considerations to preventing long COVID. The twin considerations are the indiscriminate risk of long COVID and the need to maintain measures to minimise that risk as social distancing measures are released to the public. My lady, we invite you to recommend that the long-term health consequences of a novel virus are planned for, identified, monitored, measured and factored into any response to a pandemic. These recommendations are equally relevant today. The COVID-19 pandemic endures, yet long COVID is no longer being counted or reported on. Recommendations relevant to long-term sequelae could fall within 4 broad categories, all drawn from the evidence related to long COVID. First, surveillance systems should be in place from the outset of the pandemic, preferably in the form of sleeping studies, to identify and monitor data on the impact of longer-term sequelae so that long-term health implications can be recognised early. Second, the long-term health consequences of a novel virus must be factored into decisions made in response to the transmission of the virus and included in assessments of the necessity for NPIs and PIs, as they may have a different risk profile to acute infections and add to the burden of the disease. Third, decision makers should take a preventative approach and provide clear, timely and consistent public messaging on the long-term consequences of infection throughout a pandemic to raise awareness of the risk of long-term consequences, to encourage protective behaviour and signpost available treatment resources. And fourth, adult and child patient voices should be involved from an early stage of any pandemic response to ensure that policies are responsive to people's needs. These 4 categories of recommendations would ensure that the avoidable, ongoing suffering of nearly 2 million adults and children in this country is never repeated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Metzer. Mr. Freedman.
My lady, as you know, we act for disabled people's organisations, or the DPO, run by and for disabled people, and they are Disability Rights UK, Inclusion Scotland, Disability Wales and Disability Action Northern Ireland. Disabled people who have lived through and died of COVID with the knowledge that what happened to them as 60% of the COVID fatalities and what happens to them in the future as 20% of the population is largely a matter of political and social choice. In our opening submissions, we made 9 criticisms of the COVID emergency state. The evidence you have heard reinforces those criticisms. They concern the way we are governed and, by extension, under a democracy. The way we are governed and, by extension, under a democracy, the way we allow ourselves to be governed. Starting with the system. Disabled people did not exist in the UK emergency planning prior to 2020. Yet the basics of what would happen to them during COVID were foretold in 2017 by the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities. It effectively found the UK in breach of its legal duties over consultation, data collection, and emergency planning. In a separate investigation, the committee concluded that the resilience of disabled people had been placed in abject jeopardy by 10 years of austerity. These were landmark findings by a United Nations committee against a Western state. It's a rule of law issue that at no stage in any of the papers does anyone recognise these rights or the fact that the UK could conceivably breach them. This is not an accident. Since 2010, the leadership of the Conservative Party has increasingly defined itself by its opposition to what it considers the inconveniences of international law, especially the law of human rights. The UNCRPD is the global toolbox for real change. And given that the government don't and won't recognise these breaches, we say with respect, my lady, you must. The second failure is that when the pandemic broke out, not only was there no plan for disabled people, but the failure to plan was not recognised then, and it is not recognised now. Proper recognition would have publicly confronted from the outset that cuts in benefits and services had compromised the resilience of disabled people to deal with the life changes that the MPIs were about to create. It would have declared clearly that the fact that there was no whole society planning for the pandemic in the UK would rebound terribly on disabled people. It would have identified deficiencies in the gathering and use of data as the single greatest decision-making impediment going forward. It would have assembled DPOs and other parts of the third sector into an emergency network with properly funded participation and coordination between representative leaders and groups, dedicated experts, and the right members of government. It would have immediately made clear that if a significant connection between the COVID state and society was going to take place on the internet, then a large part of the disabled people was going to be disenfranchised, unable to access essential services, and not able to work from home. It would have done everything, not only to recognise the predicament of disabled people, but to substantially redistribute financial resources to meet their basic needs. That level of public reckoning and consequential planning did not happen. Instead, the testimony of ministerial witnesses produced two highly problematic answers as to why it did not matter that there was no plan. The first, from Mr. Tomlinson, Mrs. Badenoch, Mr. Gove and Mr. Johnson, was essentially that the risks of COVID to disabled people were so obvious that all of government was no doubt working on them. My lady, they were obvious to everyone, but the responsibility of no one. No one was responsible for holistic cross-government leadership and identification of gaps. And when civil servants were finally pushed to deliver ambitious proposals after Michael Gove's October 2020 letter about terrible missed opportunities and time running out for the second wave, none of the major proposals were adopted. The second problematic answer came from the previous Minister for Disabled People, Justin Tomlinson, the witness nominally responsible for producing her plan. His repeated response to our questioning as to why there was no plan was, that's just not how government works. Tomlinson's answer leads to our third criticism of the machinery of government. Instead of a Department of State for Inequalities, which includes disabled people in its portfolio, we have a disability unit that deals only with policy. My lady, to borrow Mr. Gove's analogy, equality issues are shoved into the Cabinet Office portmanteau and then divided inefficiently across other departments. Justin Tomlinson was not a lead minister for disabled people. He was, in effect, a minister for disability benefits who did some front-of-house meetings with disabled groups. The writing out of disabled people from Kemi Badenoch's investigations into disparities is a case in point. Who directed it? Badenoch said she discussed it with Liz Truss, but any such decision was not written down. Tomlinson knew nothing about the decision. Hancock, who saw the purpose of the Badenoch review to, quote, improve understanding of drivers for disparities to inform decision-making, was never told that those drivers for disabled people were going to be overlooked. Boris Johnson did not know why they were either, but going back to the no one being responsible, he assured you it was all being done elsewhere. In our submission, they all said that because they know now it should have been, but it was not. Our fourth criticism is about expertise. Not the integrity with which it was provided, but its gaps and unexposed assumptions. Pandemic science is not socially neutral. That is because the impact of pandemics is fundamentally determined by inequalities, such that the outcomes of clinical advice cannot be hermetically sealed from social consequences. These distinctions matter to disabled people, because their struggles are so often rationalised as inevitable due to their conditions, rather than socially conditioned by our treatment of them. That is why the case for more diverse representation of expertise in the provision of advice was so strong, not only for those within the advisory groups to contemplate the broad horizons of what they were advising about, but as Professor Vallance noted, for those within government structures to ask the pertinent questions of their advisors in the first place. Our fifth criticism is that in real time, the predicaments of disabled people were largely unrecognised. We know from the DHSC battle plans that the primary focus was on the clinically vulnerable. Broader health and social inequalities were not part of initial planning. Strategies to protect the vulnerable and the overlaps and distinctions between clinical and social vulnerability failed in ways that most of the witnesses you have heard from have either not been able to comprehend or admit. There are several examples relating to food, other essential supplies, and social care. But my lady, reflect please on Down syndrome. The question for the medical officers was not who is to blame for why people with Downs were not designated as clinically extremely vulnerable earlier than November 2020, when the potential risk was flagged in June 2020. The question was, what could have been done to speed that designation up? It is difficult to comprehend Professor Whitty's answer that the delay was caused by the need to balance the nature of the risk with the social imposition of lockdown. It was the duty of the medics to advise on the risks, and then the responsibility of government to facilitate a sufficient shielding package. Neither do we accept Professor Harris's answer that the medical situation was too uncertain before an earlier date. Apart from anything, COVID-0 received the recommendation to add Down syndrome to the CEV list as of the 1st of October, but the letter did not go out until a month later. Overall, the answers around Down syndrome are disappointing. The medical advisors were unwilling to engage with the fact that this was a disastrous event, that the delay was caused by not acquiring data quickly enough, the absence of a sufficient data collecting system, and the lack of coordination with the Downs community and their carers to get that data earlier and work out better shielding packages. Our sixth criticism is the lack of real engagement. When people refer you to consultation, they often do not mean the same thing. When government and civil servants talk about consultation, they can mean set-piece meetings or discussions with those who speak for people rather than speaking with the people themselves. And most often they mean some sort of questionnaire on the internet. When DPOs and other representative groups of marginalised people talk of consultation, they mean collaboration as equals between elected officials, experts and themselves. They mean co-production and co-design. My lady, we don't apologise for introducing this language that will potentially be new to some, and note in any event that it was used by Narc, Sedwell and others. The language reflects the method to make the needed change happen. Entitlement to this collaborative consultation also represents a human right under the UNCRPD, as opposed to some sort of discretionary gift of government. One of the lessons of this module is that we still tolerate an old-fashioned elite system of club government, literally in a Georgian townhouse, where good chaps willing to ask their, quote, stupid laddie questions, unquote, of civil servants and experts, even in language they are ashamed of when made public, is regarded as somehow enough and even something to aspire to. COVID showed all too painfully that it is not. The practical benefit of co-production and co-design would have been to bring diverse lived experience and, where necessary, rebel voices into the room. People capable of speaking to elites as equals and without mediation. In a fast-moving emergency of this type, engagement can provide vital knowledge to government that will otherwise only be recognised after the damage is done. Our seventh criticism concerns data. Even if obliged to plan from scratch, government could have known more about clinical and social risks earlier. It could have logged into local communities and representative groups and been more intelligent about the consequences of its decisions. If data was COVID's decision-making's Achilles heel, we press again that not one witness has recognised that data collection and utilisation in this area is a human right of disabled people. Gavin Freegard summarised government reports over 3 decades, including 15 published since the UK signed the UNCRPD, none of which mention Article 31 of that convention, which requires the collection of data based on individual impairment and contrary to Kemi Badenoch's approach. Understands the duty to collect data that relates disability to a range of other characteristics, including race, sex, gender, income and geography, in order to properly understand it. This deficiency is still far from resolved. A July 2022 ONS paper found that the Health Service is still not collecting data on individual impairments and fails to take into account other social factors. All in all, in this country, especially for disabled people, we are in a state of ignorance by design. The eighth criticism is that in fundamental ways, disabled people were left without protection during COVID. Like others, the DPO focused on the care sector. It was not wrong to try to protect hospitals. What was wrong was to do so little to protect those in care in the name of protecting hospitals. In their evidence, both Professors Van Tam and Harris had to confront how obvious it would have been to any public health practitioners that mass release of hospital patients into care settings would create devastating consequences, both through patient infection and multiple movements of the workforce. In addition, and in the situation as of mid-March 2020, neither saw any practical alternative because available facilities and structures offered none. And then this week, despite the evidence of his own Minister for Care, the present Prime Minister sat here and failed to acknowledge that low pay drove care staff to work in multiple locations, inadvertently spreading the virus. And that, we say, must change. The DPO's final criticism concerns pandemic economics and its deliberate failure to redistribute to those most in need. Mr. Sunak, when Chancellor of the Exchequer on the 11th of March 2020, made a promise, quote, to support the most vulnerable people in the form of a safety net for those who could not work, whether they were ill themselves or not at work, as they were self-isolating. These words are revealing. The safety net would only exist for those who had been able to work but were able to do so no longer. The provision of extra funding was to maintain the economic status quo for these people, to provide temporary assistance to what we refer to in our opening submissions as the politically idealised person under our contemporary economics, who is autonomous, independent and self-sufficient. There was no proper safety net for those deemed unproductive, or recognition that those only just scraping by after a decade of cuts to benefits and services would face further financial hardship. During the pandemic, 1.5 million bounce-back loans worth £47 billion were provided to business. In contrast, universal credit was topped up by £20 a week, but there was no top-up for those on legacy benefits, and no top-up for carers' allowance in England, despite demand on carers' responsibility and time increasing sharply. Helen McNamara's evidence referred to decision-makers often failing to see the human consequence of decisions. COVID economic policy involved a chronic failure of imagination and empathy. A failure to think through what it means if you or the person you care for can no longer get supermarket deliveries, so you have to go to your corner shop, which is more expensive. If you have to stay inside because public spaces are closed, so your heating bills go up. If you have to pay for taxis because public transport is unsafe. In the early days of the pandemic, 100,000 unpaid carers were using food banks and 226,000 cut back on their food just to get by. That arose from governmental choice. Wales and Scotland made additional payments to unpaid carers during the pandemic. England did not. £67.25 per week for full-time unpaid care was apparently enough. Where do these 9 criticisms leave us? First, it's tempting to believe that replacement of bad leadership will necessarily lead to better outcomes. However, this disaster was a long time in the making. Our system of government, including cabinet government, the civil service, and the seriously outdated relationship between central and local government and civil society, could not handle this type of crisis. It was hubris to believe that it could, and it would be even greater hubris to think it can in the future. Second, since the 1980s, we have lacked a positive vision of the state in this country that we once had. We do not see it as a source of public good, and when it was called upon to be just that, surprisingly it faltered. Finally, there is what McNamara has called a want of a humanity as a feature of the bureaucratic mindset. The COVID saga reveals a dire confusion of values, and in the end begs the question of what we as a collective of people care about. Certainly for now, caring about caring and being cared for is not recognised as the primary value of social life and central principle of any form of good governance, but it should be. For disabled people who know that the question on that whiteboard, who will look after those who cannot survive alone, was never answered, the imperative to care about caring and being cared for them is a fundamental one. And given that we are all vulnerable, born vulnerable, vulnerable at the end of life, and face vulnerability at any moment in our lives, we should all care about it too. My lady, what do these matters have to do with you? And why are they so relevant to this inquiry fulfilling its function? With respect, you cannot just produce a brilliant chronology with intermittent criticisms. You hold a pen over the way we live, and in substantial ways, the way we can die. Mention has been made that the inquiry cannot be political or be expected to solve all manner of problems. We understand, but we have important final caveats. Being non-political is being political when it takes the status quo as a given. It is political not to say anything in reporting about the extent to which inequalities, including their denial and diminishment, played a causative role in COVID's outcomes. Equally, declaring that one cannot change the world is a means of overlooking the ways in which you can. The resignation that these matters are too big for this inquiry should never be accepted. if not in this forum, despite the compelling expert and witness evidence which links negative COVID outcomes to chosen societal inequality, when or where could such matters truly be engaged with? That is what this inquiry is particularly empowered to do and should do. It must make the necessary findings and recommendations in the search for new governmental structures and values that were too often lacking in the COVID response. My lady, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Freedman. I would be very grateful if everyone could avoid references to party politics. I appreciate politics generally have been playing a part, but not party politics. And of course, I am totally bound by my terms of reference. Who's next? Miss Fee. Where are you? Ah, back. Got you.
My lady, may I first thank you and your team for kindly accommodating me to make my submissions today. I appear for the Executive Office of Northern Ireland. I'm instructed by Joan McElhatton of the Departmental Solicitor's Office in Belfast, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to make these observations to you today. The Executive Office has watched closely the evidence of all the witnesses in this module and makes the following brief observations, trusting that these matters will be the subject of consideration during Module 2C in Belfast next April. Firstly, my lady, in relation to the extent of the involvement of the devolved administrations, in particular Northern Ireland, in decision-making by the UK Government, the Executive Office has some misgivings in relation to the impression that has been given by some witnesses to this module as to the extent of that participation by the devolved administrations, including Northern Ireland, in UK Government decision-making. The Executive Office noted, for example, the evidence of Lord Lister, who said that he had regular meetings with the devolved administrations and undertook liaison with the Republic of Ireland. Therefore, the Executive Office would seek clarity upon with whom Lord Lister is to have met, how the meetings were recorded, and the means by which the Northern Ireland Executive were appraised of those interactions, including with the Republic of Ireland. The Executive Office heard evidence from Sir Mark Sedwill that decisions were taken within COBRA together with the devolved administrations, and that he ensured that formal decisions were taken within the ministerial implementation groups. However, he also said that Northern Ireland and the other devolved administrations were not at the MIGs as of right and were not always invited to attend. Across all First Ministers of the devolved administrations, frustrations have been expressed with their role at COBRA, which was viewed as a mere formality, in circumstances where decisions already made in Number 10 were announced, some already being announced beforehand. When attendance at COBRA was replaced with CDL calls, the devolved administrations viewed those as perhaps more of an information sharing forum than a means by which they could properly participate in decision making, which would impact all of the UK or set a context for devolved decision making. The Executive Office heard the evidence that the devolved administrations apparently participated fully in the COVID action plan prepared by Cabinet Office at the start of March 2020. You also heard evidence from Matt Hancock, who asserted that whilst the plan was being worked up by his department throughout February, no one actually saw the COVID action plan before 7 p.m. on the 27th of February 2020. The devolved administrations were required to provide their input by 10 a.m. the following day. Clarity is therefore sought on the true extent of that input and involvement. Secondly, my lady, in relation to the extent of Northern Ireland's involvement in the expert and scientific groups, and I realise I may be echoing some of my learned friend Miss Campbell, King's Council's submissions, but perhaps from a slightly different slant. Sir Patrick Vallance gave evidence that he had regular meetings with the chief scientific advisors from the devolved. That stage from the 7th of April 2020 and did attend executive meetings from an early stage alongside the Northern Ireland CMO. Graham Medley from SPI-M gave evidence that he didn't have any contact with Northern Ireland's Chief Medical Officer, which he regretted, but for which he could give no reason. Professor Sir Chris Whitty gave evidence that on issues of personal protective equipment, they were agreed on a four nations basis, whereas, my lady, this statement must clearly be explored further in future modules. The Executive Office has heard the evidence that SAGE was the vehicle to get data to COBRA and apparently all government departments could and did attend SAGE to hear all the views. Professor Sir Chris Whitty also said there were other sources of scientific advice to inform decision-making, and clarification is therefore sought on what were those sources and how were they shared with the devolved administrations. Professor Chris Whitty gave evidence that each of the 4 chief medical officers in each of the 4 nations advised their ministers to enter lockdown. However, the Executive Office says this is contrary to other and conflicting sources of evidence, revealing that the collective view was that lockdown was needed, and that was arrived at between the 12th and 14th of March, and the decision then was taken within Number 10 on Sunday the 22nd of March and announced at Cobra on the 23rd of March. There was no evidence about how the devolved administrations were alleged to have been involved or consulted upon on that decision. My lady, a precise timeline must be established. In relation to SAGE itself, my lady, Northern Ireland was not in attendance until the 7th of April, and SAGE Secretariat incorrectly recorded Ian Young as Northern Ireland's Chief Medical Officer throughout. As the Executive Office were not party to the SAGE papers, or the debates or discussions until the 7th of April, and as only those sanitised minutes went to Cobra and were not subject to any further challenge, the Executive Office notes that Northern Ireland must have been placed at a distinct disadvantage in that regard. The result must have included lack of awareness of information, for example, about human-to-human transmission being discussed on the 28th of January, references perhaps to Professor Ferguson's email to Number 10 on the 10th of March seeking faster pace of measures, or updates to Number 10 on the 10th of March confirming an 8% mortality rate in Italy. Could the SAGE minutes and the actions of UK government, for example, on how safe it was for sports events to proceed, such as Cheltenham or that Liverpool match, be viewed as creating a different and unwarranted impression for devolved administrations who were not party to the debate within SAGE and around SAGE at that time, and who sought those assurances? In relation to SAGE subgroups, Northern Ireland was represented at 4 of 39 SPY MO meetings. That's about 10%. In relation to nerve tag, Northern Ireland was not represented until January 2021, when Professor Stuart Elburn of Queen's University Belfast attended. In relation to the extraordinary nerve tag SPY no devolved administrations attended on the 26th of April 20. Wales did attend 8 of the 11 bird table meetings, but never Northern Ireland. No devolved administrations were at the 12 clinical risk subgroup meetings, nor the 4 therapeutics subcommittee meetings. On the available evidence as to attendees, Northern Ireland attended 49 of 81 ministerial implementation group meetings. My lady, clarity is sought on how Northern Ireland was informed of or invited to such important meetings. It might be reasonable to say that Northern Ireland was not adequately represented at scientific or expert group meetings, or at least they could have been better included. Northern Ireland's Chief Medical Officer has provided evidence that Northern Ireland does not have the capability to replicate those UK-based groups, but it would also seem that Northern Ireland was not properly represented at them either. My lady, this issue will undoubtedly be considered in detail in Module 2C, including the mechanism by which a Northern Ireland department or the Northern Ireland Government representation is secured at those groups. The inquiry has previously heard how there was no Northern Ireland representative at Exercise Alice in 2016. The mode of communication to the Northern Ireland Government may also be worthy of some consideration, in particular in the situation where there might be no ministers in place for considerable periods in Northern Ireland. My lady, turning to consideration of the Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland as a single epidemiological unit, Professor Sir Chris Whitty said the differing epidemiology of Northern Ireland was not a matter for SAGE. The Executive Office seeks clarification as to why it was not a matter for SAGE, given SAGE's role as a UK-wide science advisor to COBRA. If it wasn't a matter for SAGE, my lady, who should have been considering the issue? The Executive Office wishes to explore whether a positive decision was taken to exclude the issue from SAGE's remit, or whether insufficient or no consideration was given to this issue at all. Related to that, my lady, is my final issue in relation to consideration of Northern Ireland's border. The Executive Office is live to the border issues as particular concern for the bereaved families and those affected from Northern Ireland. The Executive Office now seeks clarity on the position the UK Government took on matters engaging the border, the common travel area, and other matters within its competence. On the 28th of January 2020, SAGE wrote to Number 10 asking them to move to escalate this as a major issue across government, not just as previously within technical agencies housed within the Department of Health. At that time, the priority was to prevent the spread of the virus in the UK. SAGE recommended a change in the UK Government's approach once triggers were reached. When pressed by my learned friend Mr Keith King's counsel as to what Professor Sir Chris Whitty meant UK Government should have been doing at that time, he replied, well, the earliest things that would have to be considered, and they are not easy, and we should really talk about them either seriously or not at all, are border measures, which require a lot of thinking. They've got implications for trade, they've got implications for diplomacy, they've got implications for the economy, they've got implications for consular, etc. But that's because one of your earliest things is to reduce the risk of importation. My lady, the issue for clarification for Northern Ireland is to what extent the particularities of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and the border in Northern Ireland were considered by the UK Government during this early phase so as to reduce the risk of importation, particularly given the Northern Ireland Republic of Ireland border, which is the only land border the UK has with the European Union. If international borders were recommended for discussion, what consideration, if any, was given to the Northern Ireland border? My lady, the above matters are not exhaustive, but the Executive Office hopes it is helpful to identify them at an early stage. Thank you.
I'll only just say this, Ms Faye, I'm afraid it's not an early stage, it's a closing submissions to Module 2. You raise a number of questions, some of which will obviously be dealt with in more detail in 2C, but some of which we have already explored. And we've completed the oral evidence for 2 now, and I have no plans to reopen the oral evidence. And where you seek clarity on a number of issues that were meant to be explored in 2, I'm afraid the only possible answer is to look in the written evidence to see if that will assist you. Otherwise, I'm afraid you may not get the answers that perhaps questions should have been asked when the evidence was called. Anyway, I'll leave matters there. And I think it's now time to break for lunch. I think our stenographers had a long morning with everyone trying to keep to their time limits, for which I'm very grateful. We shall return at 1:45, and I think it's Mr Menon, you're first up.